Usually if they're the President of the United States, you've never met them before, so you don't really know what to expect. Will they play the game? Will they tell it like a story?
Tell me what I'm thinking. Good. I saw the 4 questions. General areas you're interested in?
Will they just give you the line that they give to any interviewer, or because it's their chance to tell what really happened, what it was like to be there?
Was I looking too harsh, Brian?
What it's like to be president.
I thought I looked fine. But Brian
Would they really think back?
Well, he's not, but he's opinionated.
Imagine themselves inside the room and just tell you what happened.
So you'll give me the question, which will prompt a response. If there's something on that topic that you want to follow up on,
when it happens,
feel free to.
When they do,
don't worry. Just interject.
There's nothing like it.
Not trying to filibuster here. So.
I mean, you almost stop breathing.
I'm going off on a tangent.
I'm Norma Percy, and for decades more than I care to remember, I've been making documentaries.
If you have other questions to ask me now about the hostage crisis, I'll be glad to answer those.
Me and my team, we've interviewed presidents, prime ministers.
After a time in the meeting,
world leaders, good and bad.
Clinton said to me, look, why don't we just go to my study and have a talk about it all.
Our series have covered the end of the Soviet Union, while Glasnost was happening. The death of Yugoslavia. The political endgame in Ireland.
And then someone shouted, "That's a mortar." And everybody ducked under the table.
Israel and the Arabs. Elusive peace in the Middle East.
There were 2 meetings with Arafat during a period of roughly 3 days.
You and I, we're going to change this country.
Barack Obama's White House, where my chance to meet the president turned out to be a total disaster. Knocked out, literally.
Now is the time to finally keep the promise.
Doorstepping is not my style. I write letters.
Every single American.
And anyone who's worth having says no at least 3 times.
On his face, he said, "Well, then of course I'm feeling lucky."
You just have to keep trying. And even when they say yes, no interview is ever easy.
She does not give up. Ever. She'll be asking for an interview and she'll be told in no uncertain terms by the most powerful man in the world, no, I will not give you an interview. And a sort of little look will cross Norma's face, which is the look when someone says no. And she'll go back into her office, her very messy office, and she'll write another letter.
She herself never appears and is never heard in any of the work that she's done. She allows the players in history to perform for themselves. Milosevic, Gorbachev, the whole 9 yards. People who were never easily accessible.
It is those people speaking, and it's one of the reasons she always insists on subtitles rather than voiceover, so you can hear their voice and they are bearing witness themselves to what they saw.
Right at the heart is storytelling. And people underestimate this. They think that Norma's programs are high politics. They're not. They're high stories. And they are the stories and the wit and the human beings involved.
One of the hardest things to decide when you're doing an interview is how much you can push it. For example, there was Bill Clinton.
So I should say what the question was. Yeah. Got it.
Tell it as a complete.
Yeah, I got it.
There we are for an interview for our second series on the Arab-Israeli conflict, elusive peace. I said to Ehud, look, tell it like
Arafat. Yeah, I got
direct speech. He finally agreed to do it.
Yeah.
You really are extremely good. We arrived for the interview that was supposed to be at 2 o'clock and set up in this library with the worst air conditioning I've ever heard. And we set up and waited and waited and waited.
And I'm very, very apologetic. I hate to make people wait, but I didn't want you, as hard as you've worked on the special, you didn't need a lousy, an uninformed talk.
Look
Go
at
ahead.
me, even if I'm looking down at the questions, look.
I'll do it.
Realizing we were under time pressure, I tried to get straight to the first big question, which was about his meeting with President Assad of Syria in Geneva. So I asked,
Well, the reason it was hard to get Assad to come in March is because of the failure of the talks at Shepherdstown.
Now, Shepherdstown was a big meeting between the Syrians and the Israelis, brokered by the Americans. And the heavy behind me saying, you only have 15 minutes, and making a gesture to cut his throat. Said, I'm sorry, but, we don't have much time.
Yeah, but you can't ask me to do this. I'm not going to prepare. That exonerates. I mean, I can't cooperate in what I think is a dishonest presentation.
Oh, no, it's just that the way
I understand. You may not want to talk about Shepherdstown, but the reason Assad didn't want to come is because he agreed to send his foreign minister to Shepherdstown, and nothing happened.
So on we go.
For 4 or 5 days.
I knew that there was Camp David, but not only Camp David. The Clinton parameters, which he presented to Barak and Arafat Christmas, just before he left, within weeks of his going, were probably the best crafted deal ever on the Arab-Israeli conflict.
But I said, this really is a basis for an agreement. And I got up and I walked out and I waited.
The Israelis said yes at first. And I knew that at the last minute, at a meeting in the White House, they both turned them down flat. That Arafat turned it down, yes, but President Barak of Israel also had cold feet. You have a phone call with Barak in which you're trying. And I wanted Clinton to explain that. Clinton bridled.
We can't have this conversation. Because we can't. I'm not going to. I can't cooperate with you on that. I can't say something that's not so.
Barak?
What?
We're certainly not asking you. Mark Anderson, producer-director, and I've worked with Norma for a good 20 years. Now, fortunately, this was the end of the interview with Clinton. We were already running well over time. But he'd been good enough to stay there and talk because it's difficult to walk away from Norma. So Norma said, well, Mr. President, we've heard from the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, that when it came to the crunch, he felt he could not sign.
I just talked to all my people about it. The Israeli cabinet accepted the parameters and never rejected them. There was never a rejection of the parameters.
But
Barak, by the 1st of January,
we knew we were right. We were quoting the Prime Minister of Israel.
Was under enormous political.
We weren't taking any line whatsoever.
But there was never a time when the Israeli cabinet withdrew its acceptance of the parameters.
We were entirely within our rights.
Formally did, but
he said it quite reasonably.
And I understood that.
Well, I was getting a bit cocky, so I tried again. One quote on this 1st of January. Barak rings, because he tells us this, and says, I can't have these parameters before.
I'm not going to go along with it. I've already told you that. I will not say something to you. I don't turn that camera off.
And he ripped off his mic and stormed out. Bright red. I think we went over the line.
But I'd done it. I had contradicted him and got away with it. I got him to cover all the high points. And, I sat in front of Bill Clinton and got him to play the game in the way I wanted.
I would say Norma is a difficult colleague. Norma has a very clear view of what she has got to get on top of and what access she has got to get, and an absolute determination to get it. Brian Lapping. I've been working in television for more than 40 years, most of that time with Norma, and all the projects that I've cared most about have been with her. When you know that you have been refused 10 times an interview with somebody you consider important, when the series has been finished and delivered not just to the BBC but to other broadcasters and all the money has been spent, who keeps on trying and insists on keeping on trying? She got President Obama when we'd pretty well delivered the series to the BBC and to the French.
It's interesting. The title of this job is Leader of the Free World, Commander-in-Chief. It is an extraordinary office, and it is extremely humbling.
Norma cannot stop.
This is Martin McGuinness speaking to you in Derry. Do you want me to look at you?
Yeah, definitely look at me. And it's quite important. If you look at away from me, you look like you're avoiding the viewer's eye, and you look a bit shifty, so look at me. Even though I sometimes look down to see what the next question is, look at me. Okay.
It's pretty I can't look down to see what the answer is.
Yeah. Okay. But listen, if you want to stop and get briefed as to what we think the answer is.
Dan Edge, I'm a filmmaker. I worked for Norma on several projects, Endgame in Ireland and Elusive Peace, which was about the Israeli-Arab conflict.
Good. Okay, so the first question is about the
one moment I nearly quit was at 3:30 in the morning in Belfast, in some horrible, haunted house we were all living in while we were making this film, trying to get interviews with Sinn Féin. I started to see papers being pushed under a crack in the door. Not just one piece of paper, but questions and more questions, all covered in red scribbles, with the note at the top saying something like, "Don't worry, we don't have to send these off till 6 a.m. So I knew I had to get up and spend time deciphering that, and I nearly quit. But I didn't, and she does sort of inspire loyalty, Norma, in that I got up, did it, I faxed the questions off, we were still faxing at that point, and it got done.
I'm a native New Yorker. I went to college in the Midwest. When I was getting to the end of my degree, I asked my favorite professor where I should go to graduate school. And he said, "What do you want out of graduate school?" And I said, "To find out how politics really works and get as far as possible from my family." He sent me to the LSE. While I was at LSE, I ran out of money, and I got a job as an MP's researcher in the House of Commons. It was heaven. And I probably would be there still, sitting in the Strangers' Bar collecting the gossip, were it not for Brian Lapping, who turned up one day looking for a researcher on a big series he'd just been commissioned to do on what was wrong with Parliament.
The series in which the method that Norma has really worked at brilliantly over all these years got developed was called End of Empire, a series made for Granada Television in 1985. We interviewed Lord Harding. He had been Britain's governor of Cyprus. A very distinguished soldier. He'd been commander-in-chief of everything you can imagine. He conducted amazingly complex negotiations, which he described for us. None of that was the important thing. The important thing was when he told us, "You must interview my wife." Why? And he said, "Oh, she'll tell you the story about the bomb that was placed under our bed."
I always get up very late, I'm sorry to say, in the morning.
And she and he both told the story of the bomb that was placed under their bed.
And one of the soldiers came in and said, "There's a bomb in His Excellency's bed." So I went and looked, and there was this thing. I'd never seen a bomb before, but there was this bomb there, and I very nearly touched it flicked it with my fingers, and I said, "Well, it must be a dud, because it was there all night."
And then we found that the man who had placed the bomb under their bed was by then the police chief in independent Cyprus. And so we interviewed him.
I get immediately to the bedroom of the governor. I closed the door, and immediately I took the bomb out of my corset, and I put it in the mattress under the bed. You see, they were sleeping on separate beds. They were nearby the beds, but they were separate, two beds, And closed the beds just to kill both of them, not to have her to cry after him,
And so we got the story of a particular little incident, a bomb placed under the bed, told by all three participants. That is what drove us to want to do more of that. If you can get all parties who were there and who were affected, it somehow makes you blink.
What we do is to try and show the viewer what it's like inside the room when the really big political decisions are made.
President Bush convened a meeting with Senator McCain, my opponent, and myself, as well as the congressional leaders, to talk about steps that needed to be taken.
The thing is that most of these decisions are made in private.
I think it was in early February, and we had a cabinet meeting on the Gulf War. And the War Cabinet, the most senior,
Only the people who were there, and the people who were there are presidents and prime ministers and really top people.
And I was talking about...
Only the people who were there know that these meetings took place at all.
Right. I said to Bill, look, we've not just...
So we really spend a considerable amount of time, once we get started, in trying to find out what these decisions are.
To go after Milosevic with everything we got to whack him hard.
Jonathan Friedland, journalist and columnist. Politicians will, if given half a chance, go very windy and airy and abstract and talk in generalities about their overall philosophy. What Norma Percy does is force them to say, who was in the room? Why was that person not in the room? She forces them to talk about who's there, how much sleep they've had.
You were dead tired when you arrived at the
I was exhausted. It was late at night.
She forces them to remember the actual moment and the mechanics of a real decision.
Some hoax bombs in San Diego.
I remember that very well.
So start with Nancy and Tony coming into your office to make the final decision.
So, well, we knew we had to make a decision.
There's one episode where she talks about Obama at the climate change talks and how they go upstairs and walk down a corridor and go into a room where there's a Chinese delegation.
We just continued down the hall, saying, president's coming through, president's coming through.
It is hardball, actual negotiation.
Obama had the Chinese premier at a disadvantage, and he did not relent.
So here we were, Brian Lapping and I, a new independent company, with a commission from the BBC to tell the story of Gorbachev. From the beginning, we called it Gorbachev's Second Russian Revolution.
The key thing is always getting somebody who is prepared to open a door. And Russia was a peculiarly difficult place to open doors into. I think it still is, because it's an authoritarian regime. Under Gorbachev, it was a bit more liberal.
We were lucky. This was 1989. Gorbachev had been leader for some years, and his policy of glasnost, openness, was beginning to take hold. Yeltsin, in the 2 years we were making our program, his fortunes seesawed. He'd become a Kremlin politician with the help of Gorbachev, but he'd gone too far in trying to unleash democracy before the Soviet Union was ready for it, and he was out. Our problem in that case was finding him. We finally chased him down to a health farm in Stavropol, where we thought he was hiding out. Later it probably was pretty clear he was being dried out.
Angus McQueen, I'm a director of documentaries. They finished the 6 programs, and the coup against Gorbachev happened.
To ensure law and order, a state of emergency is introduced for 6 months as of 4 o'clock Moscow time on August 19th, 1991.
He was kidnapped and taken down to the Crimea, and these generals, in this slightly lunatic way, wanted to change the whole course of Soviet history. He got released and went back to Moscow.
Gorbachev was still president, and we got everybody else, but not Gorbachev.
And then a process of months, if not years, pretty classic, Norma, trails to getting Gorbachev to agree to give the interview 2 weeks before the end of the Soviet Union. So it's an extraordinary moment.
On the evening of the 29th of July, the 3 leaders got together.
And there was this astonishing occasion where he met with, interestingly, the man who is still the president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and Boris Yeltsin at his dacha, which was called Novogorova, outside Moscow. It was a meeting about what was going to be compromised and what compromises he was willing to make about the future of the shape of the Soviet Union, and it was the essence of that deal that caused the coup, that caused the chief of security and others in the KGB to back the idea of overthrowing Gorbachev. And it only came out in the interview with Gorbachev. So we're at this meeting, critical meeting, and Gorbachev says, Boris Yeltsin became concerned that no one should know about this.
Кто не должен быть и не должен знать об этом. Это действительно вещи серьезные.
These were sensitive matters.
А вещи серьезные.
And Yeltsin went out onto the balcony.
Это так. Он встал и вышел.
He said, I'm going out to see if anybody's eavesdropping. Then I laughed. I had to laugh. But now looking back, we know that Yeltsin was right. Somebody was very interested in what we were saying. It really happened. Basically, the KGB was bugging my meeting. The man who did it was Plekhanov, my own chief of security.
Его информация могла подстегнуть события.
So I issued the visa. And for a while...
You're going too fast. There's a big decision on Sunday. Okay.
We did it on Sunday.
Yeah. So on Saturday, you asked Nancy to go up and...
John Snow, broadcast journalist.
Get the statement.
The confrontational style of interview is really made for on the day, in the week, at the moment, at the time, and it, of necessity, is cutting corners. There's no question. You're trying to provoke somebody to quickly fill in the facts, or the facts as they see them, and enable you to do what you've got to do at some speed.
And he just thought it was a terrible idea, and he told me.
I don't think that she's really interested in rolling them over in the same way that we are.
Fiona Sturton, journalist, and I was an executive producer on Norma's series Israel and the Arabs, Elusive Peace. She does want people to know in advance what the questions are going to be, because she wants them to look up their notes, to go back in their memories to that moment. It is much more forensic and researched in advance, and in a funny sort of way, I think it's almost like in a court of law. You know, they say, don't they, that a barrister should never ask a question where he doesn't know the answer?
Can you imagine a country where you can still find ancient towns run by a crystal clear sea? Yugoslavia is a country with a long, turbulent history.
I was approached by Austrian television saying they wanted a series about Yugoslavia. This was early in the Yugoslav war.
I got the target on my nose. Hey, what are you aiming at, sir? I'm at it right at it.
I was convinced that, A, nobody knows about Yugoslavia, and it's such a complicated country, and during a war you can never succeed in making a series. And Norma said, I was mad. We must try.
The story of the death of Yugoslavia was the story of Slobodan Milosevic. I mean, he was one person that you absolutely had to get.
He was seen to be the evil monster that was behind it all, sort of knew what his reputation was. So people coming and asking for an interview was difficult, but he did finally give us a research interview.
1987. godine mi smo se suočili pre svega sa problemom jednog specifičnog položaja Srbije unutar Jugoslavije.
We stayed up all night trying to find the questions. It had to be kind of meaty enough to learn something, but obviously we didn't want to scare him off. This is an off-the-record research interview. This is getting to know him. We had our questions. I had them in my handbag, and off we went. And we came in, he sat down, he put the clock on the table, and then, well, look me in the eye was what I was about to say, but it was more than that. He sort of locked me in a gaze.
She was so transfixed by Milosevic that her hand, which was on these questions that we had spent days sculpting to work out how we were going to do it, her hand was caught in her bag behind her, literally caught in it. She didn't move. And of course, the whole process was extraordinary because we were being weird. Most people, you get an interview with Milosevic, I think he expected it, turn up with the camera and shoot the interview and ask, well, we weren't doing that. We were saying, oh no, sir, we're just here for a preparation. We just want to talk to you.
Okay, let me take you through that morning, because I find it a really dramatic morning. You get the statement, and then...
The method is very, very specific, and there can be no deviation from the method.
Warren Christopher, and you have quite a difficult 25-minute telephone conversation, and I can imagine John Major going mad, because he did to us about it.
A huge amount of research has gone into every interview beforehand. Generally, the team knows what happened in the meeting they're trying to recreate, who said what.
And they advise it's a win-win situation.
And the filmed interview is about getting the person who was in the room at the time to say what they said.
And you were essentially in a room with Arafat, and there are guns on the table and guns in the corner. And I told him that we had a very difficult situation. The president was concerned, and the president...
This man changed the world. He took Iran and made it an inspiration for a new, uncompromising strand of Islam.
This is the man whose embrace of nationalism is blamed for all the wars in Yugoslavia today, Slobodan Milosevic.
The downside of concentrating exclusively on power politics and power politicians is you have to, in a way, take as read the underlying, deeper popular motives that they are serving and acting upon. So, in Death of Yugoslavia, you will know how Tudjman felt about Karadzic or Karadzic felt about Milosevic, etc. But you won't necessarily have a real feel in the sort of guts of what Croat nationalism was, or Serbian nationalism, or Bosnian identity, and what moved those people. The voices of the ordinary people that, in a way, the politicians were merely having to react to or represent, those you don't hear.
Sorry, but these wider movements are made up of people, and all we can do is show you the people. Television, particularly my sort of television, is not so good at why things happen. I think books are better at that.
Historian academics patronise TV like the plague, except for when they want to sell a book, and therefore they present it. But the truth is they probably haven't fully understood the genuine historical value of the recordings, the full recordings. And those are genuine historical documents. In other words, in the case of Death of Yugoslavia, it's as the thing is going on. And no doubt then reconstructed, it could be turned into that wider contextualized history. But for Norma, it is about the focus on the nature of power.
When you have a big moment and the right people who were there telling the story, there's absolutely nothing better.
And he was saying, and I was agreeing, well, there's very little chance of getting that.
Prime Minister, if you said, I said to Bill, or I said to President Clinton, right. Do it in direct speech.
Okay.
Sorry. One of my favourite moments is from our series Fall of Milosevic, our second series about Milosevic.
Speaking to Bill Clinton around August, and I said to him...
The meeting between Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, when Tony Blair sets out to try and persuade Clinton to use ground troops in the Kosovo War in 1999.
So we batted this around for a bit and agreed that in the end it was better not to put it to a vote and lose, because that would then...
It was 2002, and in this case I sensed that Blair was telling me about 1999.
The argument, I think, that was persuasive ultimately.
But the way he was telling it, it was very much in his mind when he was making his decisions in 2002 about whether to go to war in Iraq. Mention it in public and spoil the song.
Can you say I went out for
after a time in the meeting, Bill Clinton said to me, well, look, why don't we just go up to my study and have a talk about it all? Because it was obvious, you get to a point in these discussions where you have to have a very direct political discussion between the two principals.
Lawrence Freedman, historian. I worked at King's College London, where I was responsible for getting Norma Percy's archive into the college, where it can be used by students, scholars worldwide who are interested in all aspects of international affairs.
Strong psychological signal to Milosevic.
Although you're talking about the past, if you've got people who are still in office, then obviously you're talking a bit about the present as well.
Once you start it, you've got to finish it. And you've got to finish it with a victory, not a defeat.
Because what
when you
comes through Tony Blair talking about ground troops in Kosovo while he's thinking about similar issues in regard to Iraq, what you're doing is getting an understanding of the thought processes and possibly the lessons that have been learnt from one set of events that are going to be applied in another.
I think that for me at that point, I was absolutely determined then that we see this thing through. Because if we didn't, the consequences for the whole of the Balkans, for Europe, for the standing of NATO, for the position of America, for the democratic world, we're going to be grim, really grim.
I first met Bill Clinton probably 6 weeks after he left office for our series Endgame in Ireland.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth.
It was a series that tried to unpick the Irish troubles from, well, beginning with the Brighton bomb and going up to the present, which was then just after Tony Blair's big peace process win, the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, we wrote to Bill Clinton probably on the first day we started work on the project.
I got there in October.
Clinton was all alone in the House.
Early October, but almost about exactly.
Hillary was busily running for the Senate.
We arrived, setting up the cameras. I remember he was sitting in an office just off from where we were setting up the cameras. He had his feet on the desk, a big pair of white trainers, and he was yakking on the phone.
So think back to 1968, when you were a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. And when he disappeared to change, we couldn't resist snooping around the study. Over his desk was the Stars and Stripes and a delightfully tacky bit of embroidery with the name Hillary in the center.
What in the hell is that? What?
It's a truck reversing.
Should we just wait?
In our yard? Sounds like that's never happened the whole time I've been here.
We attract them.
Anyway.
I began with my first big story, which was about how Clinton decided to grant Jerry Adams a visa to go to a peace conference in America, which is actually the thing that started the whole peace process going and brought Sinn Féin into the political process. So I asked him, what happened on that Saturday afternoon when you came in, specially to make the decision on Jerry Adams' visa? He said, yeah, I remember that well.
I remember it quite well. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I just had this wonderful lunch with Helmut Kohl, who loves to eat, and so do I. So we had a big time. And I came in, and I thought, now I'm going to spoil my meal with indigestion. This is a terrible thing. And I was feeling kind of crabby, actually, but anxious to get through this. And essentially, I decided that I wanted to do it, and that I was prepared to take the heat from the State Department and the Justice Department.
And he then just went through every argument as if it happened yesterday and it was the most important decision that he'd ever taken.
I thought it was worth the risk to push the peace process forward. Look, in all these places in the world, nobody would ever get anything done if no one ever took a chance. And I wasn't in the same position of John Major or Albert Reynolds or the leaders of the parties in Northern Ireland. So what? I could be criticized. I didn't believe that our relationship with Britain would be destroyed. I thought Britain would be stronger if there were peace in Ireland. So I did it. But a lot of people thought I was crazy.
That's brilliant. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay, so this was in February.
We have this problem less now, we have digital cameras, but there was always an awkward moment in filmed interviews where you are changing the tape. And there's an unwritten law in TV that if you ask someone a question about the subject while you're changing tape, they're going to say something brilliant that you're going to miss. So you have to talk about something else. You have to talk about anything other than what you're there to talk about. So it can be incredibly awkward. And Bill Clinton pointed to a framed poem on the wall.
There were 2 lines of a poem by Seamus Heaney on his wall.
Anyway, I've got it in there on the wall. Seamus Heaney's, yeah. I'll show it to you before you leave.
Okay. It was a fortunate wind that blew me here.
And it was about the myth of Philoctetes.
Below me, he started telling us a story from the Odyssey as if it happened to him.
And he found this feral creature who had not shaved in a decade. He was living in animal skins, and his leg never healed. It had just turned into a stump, and he was limping on the stump, but he had his bow. And finally, to go on, he figures out what the deal is. Philoctetes figures out this kid's running a scam, and why are you here now? So finally, Odysseus has to come up on the island, confront the guy, tell him, I'm sorry I left you. You know, we can't win the war without you. Please come back. Please forgive me, blah, 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 blah. And he says yes. And then at the end, he says, it was a fortunate wind that blew you here. That's the nicest thing anybody ever did for me. Anyway, I've got it.
That's wonderful.
But the lines are stunning, and they're so... They're basically about how people have to give up their hatreds and their reserve and their anger and just let go sometimes. A lot of things you just got to let go of, which is the sort of lesson of a lot of these things.
That's brilliant. Wish we were recording that. How are we doing? Good. Okay. So
a good example of Norma's method of recreating a conversation, recreating an argument, and with any luck a resolution to that argument, is John Major and Albert Reynolds, two completely different people. Albert Reynolds is Irish, blarney, wicked smile the whole time, loves to tell a story, long involved story. John Major, typically the grey underpants, a man not perhaps the most exciting Prime Minister we've ever had. But in the case of Ireland, I think the subject grew to be really close to his heart. And we did, I think, 2 or 3 interviews with him during the course of the series.
How many mornings have you scheduled? I don't remember that.
Sorry,
did it?
We'd just start him off saying, so you met Albert, you know, it was Dublin Castle, whatever it might have been. Yes. Yeah.
And that was the flavour.
And he'd start telling the story in a really animated fashion. And do you want to talk about the pencil now? Yeah. Is that all right? Yeah. You can make it pretty sort of general, as it were.
There were moments of a great frustration. And at one point I was engaged in some dialogue with Albert, and someone, I think it was one of the Irish officials, I can't remember which one, reintroduced a point that we'd cleared off the table, or I thought we'd cleared off the table, an hour or 2 ago, and I was pretty frustrated. And I clenched my fist and banged the table. The pencil broke in my hand and scurried right across the table. And I think everybody thought it was a piece of ill temper. It wasn't. It was sheer frustration. It may have been a good thing. I think it concentrated. It may have ruined the pencil, but I think it concentrated minds.
That's nice.
Good.
That's nice. Yeah, very nice.
Okay.
Norma's always giving me a hard time.
She's right.
She's quite right, too. Now, we understand that this was when you had a real ding-dong with him. You said, this is bad faith, John. He snaps his pencil and he says, look, OK, why don't we go and discuss this privately? Is that your recollection? And if so, can you tell me it, please?
No, that's fair. That's
OK,
fair,
but I need to hear it from you, I'm afraid. Can you do what you said?
I tell you, look, I said, John, this is bad faith in any sense of the word. I can't buy it, I won't buy it, we'll have no summit, and we'll leave it at that, if that has to be it. He was getting frustrated with getting nowhere, and he had the pencil in his hand, as he often had, and he just bent it, and up it went in bits. So we went into the room next door, and we had a real go at each other for a while, and then we got down to business, business again. So,
is there any more detail that you can recall? Any kind of atmosphere, and you know?
Well, some of the language used.
Yes.
I wouldn't like to repeat it on television anyway. It wouldn't be great, you know. I know, but nevertheless, no, there was
for adults.
Pardon?
It's for adults.
No, but it's not all adults that look at the television either, you know. No, I mean there was rough, tough language. No question about it. I mean, what did he take me for? A stupid effing so-and-so, you know, that's sort of, you know, that's the way it was high-tempered stuff. I mean, you know, both of us had tempers, you know. Maybe his was easier controlled than mine, I'm not sure. Maybe he might say the opposite. However, no, we had a ding-dong, there's no question about it.
I had received in 1999, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of America landing on the moon, a rock from the moon, from our space agency and the astronauts who went up. And it was in a vacuum pack, and I put it on my table there in front of so everyone could see it. It was carbon dated at 3.6 billion years of age. Now, whenever people come in this room now and get mad at each other, I make them look at that rock, and I tell them it's 3.6 billion years old. We're all just passing through this life. It will be over quickly, and we might as well calm down and make the most of it. And that's it. That's sort of become, that little moon rock became a metaphor of how I thought people ought to behave.
That's great.
Okay.
So
Yeah, we've got to finish. This is going way over time.
Right, that's true. Okay, I'm sorry, but you were perfect.
Did you get what you wanted?
I got what I wanted. What I've wanted for 2 years. The interview was over, and I spied a picture of him at Camp David. Suddenly he came alive. Oh, God. Yasser Arafat. Those Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. We were so close to peace in the Middle East. And you could tell this is the thing that he woke up in the middle of the night about. Well, if this is a story that keeps President Clinton up late at night, we thought we had to go back and do it. Elusive Peace was made 4 years after Camp David, the moment when the conflict almost got settled, when Bill Clinton almost got Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak to agree peace. The story was over, but the participants were hardly retired and looking after their gardens. Bill Clinton was kind of saving the world, even though he was no longer president. Ehud Barak had just gone back into politics and was trying to become Israeli prime minister again. And Arafat, we thought Arafat would be easy to get.
He was holed up in the Makata, a fortress, surrounded by the Israelis so that he couldn't really move, virtually house imprisonment.
I have to ask the whole international world. I have to ask His Excellency President Bush. I have to ask the United Nations. Is this acceptable? That I can't go outside from the door? Is this acceptable?
And we waited and waited. He works appalling hours, rather worse than Winston Churchill, so he'll quite likely call all his people together at 1 or 2 a.m. And after many false alarms, and, we were up thinking we might get a call tonight, we did get a call.
So in we walked to this big room with a long table, and all we could see was a pile of papers, and just above it was a very famous keffiyeh and an even more famous face. The table was laid out with wonderful Arab feasts, but Arafat had in front of him a small bowl of boiled broccoli and boiled little corn cobs, and proceeded to feed me with little nibbles.
Here you are, my dear. And I think she took it from his fingers. It's almost as though he was feeding his pet dog. So there she was, munching broccoli, which actually she lives on anyway, so she must have been quite happy about that. But I think that's the only bit of broccoli she's ever had from the fingers of a president.
Clinton flew to Camp David to hold the ring. The prize was peace in the Middle East and a viable Palestinian state. An end to half a century of war. It was a high ambition, even for Washington.
The Camp David meeting had a deadline. Clinton was due at a summit meeting in Japan, and they had to settle before he left. So the Israelis closeted themselves away to come up with a final offer. The Palestinians had been demanding that their capital be in Jerusalem. What Barak suggested to Clinton was that the Palestinians could have a few little villages outside Jerusalem. Clinton, who had been waiting all day for this, blows up at him. Do it in direct speech. I'm Barak. What did you say to me?
Well, I just told him, I said, you wanted the summit. You've got to do better. You have got to do better. And I got to go to Okinawa. And I was probably a little bit intemperate in my response.
That evening, Barak was back at Clinton's cabin.
And Barak says to Clinton, I'm willing for you to propose to Arafat that we divide the old city between us. If he doesn't accept this, it'll prove that deep down he's just a terrorist. It is a big concession. For the first time, Israel was offering to divide the holy city of Jerusalem. However, Israel would keep control over Temple Mount. But of course, Temple Mount, what the Palestinians call the Haram, is exactly what Arafat wants.
So I laid out the proposal, and I said, now he really has...
So Clinton takes it and goes off to see Arafat.
Now, Barak has really moved. This is a serious offer, so you have to move. Otherwise, I'm going to Okinawa and we're quitting.
I replied him in details about what can be done from our side, which will be accepted by the Arab nation and by the Christians and by the Muslims.
Arafat was caught in a trap. Barak had offered him everything except the one thing he really wanted. He returned to his cabin to consult with his team.
She produces a game of chess, effectively. Certainly in both the Palestinian and the Northern Ireland context, you see great similarities as to how they play this game. A is going to say C, and D is going to say Q, and then there's a good chance that Z will come in and chime in with X, and then suddenly you've got checkmate. It doesn't happen very often, but she does illustrate how this game is played. And it is a game. It is a game of chess. It's terrible to think that something which is about the loss of life is about a game of chess. But that's the only way it seems to work.
A solution to the Palestinian refugee issue will need to be found through the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Moving on a few years to George Bush, when he hosted an Arab-Israeli summit in the Jordanian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. Good stories were looking pretty thin. The Palestinian negotiator, Naval Shah, told us a good one.
Is there any way you could tell that to me in direct speech? So that...
Come on, this is going to put me in trouble, Mr. Bush.
It was such a good story, the way.
But, I mean, President Bush did it in direct speech, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, President Bush said to all of us, I'm driven with a mission from God. God would tell me, George, go and end this, fight those terrorists in Afghanistan. And I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq that really oppresses the Iraqi people. And I did. And now, again, I feel God's words coming to me. Go get the Palestinians their state and get the Israelis their security and get peace in the Middle East. And by God, I'm going to do it.
Great, thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I don't think that any nation in the world has the right to bring the Israeli citizens and the state of Israel to court. No one.
Sharon is Sharon, totally bombastic, definitely never plagued with self-doubt. The only place where you really felt it was when he talked about Arafat, when he spoke with real, genuine hatred.
I didn't think for a moment that Arafat was capable of doing anything, and it's not as if I were surprised when I found out that he couldn't do anything. I never had any expectations that he was capable or wanted to do anything. This was his policy, a policy of murder. Thank you.
After the interview with Sharon, the security guards were about to whisk him away, but I had to get him talking so I could get him to sign the release form we have to get people to do. So I had to think of something, and I said, you know that bit in Aqaba when you meet George Bush, bangs you on the shoulder and says, you're looking good.
You're looking good.
Thank you so much.
I hope you're feeling good.
I feel good.
Okay, that's important.
How do you feel when the President of the United States does that? And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, and it is not your experience that I look good?
If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, tonight is your answer.
Obama, we played the game. We got some good interviews. We kept asking, how about the president? And they'd say, wait. We were getting a bit desperate. It was 2016, his last year in the presidency. The series was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks' time. Finally, we got a call. You're on. As usual, there'd be two of us at the interview. One of us to ask the questions, one of us to listen and produce the interview. In this case, that was me, and Paul Mitchell would be asking the questions.
Paul Mitchell, filmmaker.
Well, hi.
Hi.
How are you?
It's scary sitting in the White House.
Nice to see you. How you doing? You loving me up?
When you interview the president, one of the strange things that happens is there's all these people looking at you, and you're looking at him, and there's the Marine Guards in there and the Secret Service, and they tell you, we'll shoot you if you touch that clock or move that vase of flowers. And these are the flags that have been sitting in this room since 1776 or whatever it is. So it's not a normal atmosphere.
Right before I went to law school, I was traveling through Europe, and I had a friend whose girlfriend worked at the BBC. So I remember going to, this is BBC Radio, so I went to...
The essence of our method is to be multi-sided. Usually we deal with big international conflicts, and so the sides are easy. This time we're going inside one administration.
The director of the fourth program in the Obama series really wanted to get Obama to talk about a meeting he had with Bob Gates, who was Secretary of Defense, as Bob Gates tells the story, in which Gates refused to stop prosecuting gay members of the military.
We had a very candid, tough conversation in which he pushed me very hard in terms of suspending the law. And I basically told him I could not do that. He became quite angry, and he went on about it.
We had said to the White House staff this was something we wanted to get into with Obama. And it was obvious why. You get Bob Gates to tell his half of the story, you get Obama to tell his half of the story, it would be magic. You know, he says this, they say that, it goes back and forth, it works. That's how these programs work at their best. They said two things, actually. They said that he wasn't going to be very anxious to get into a back and forth with the former Secretary of Defense when the former Secretary of Defense wasn't in the room at the time that we were doing the interview. And secondly, Obama, by his nature, is best at the big stuff.
The popular protests, called the Arab Spring, started in Tunisia, then moved to Egypt.
We show the events in Tahrir Square, the demonstration,
demanding the removal of President Hosni Mubarak,
as Obama watched it in the Situation Room.
The top-down approach to history, which he adopts, so the Arab Spring has collapsed into President Obama makes a phone call to President Barak and says, we need to do something about this.
The huge crowds demanding the democracy Obama had called for presented him with a dilemma. Obama phoned Mubarak.
This sort of extraordinary emotional stuff that's going on in the streets is boiled down to one president calls another president and tries to change history.
How exactly would you show a historical force on television? Well, in one sense, I suppose you see that on the news every night. It's crowds, it's noise. That's what you see every night on the news. Our job is to show the men and women. They have up till now usually been men, but thank God there's starting to be more and more women who make the decisions about these events. I mean, that's what our form of television does.
One of the things that I've learned in this office is, there's been this long-standing debate among historians, how much is the great man or the individual leader responsible for the flow of history and how much of it is economic and social determinism. I tend to believe that it's a combination of both. I don't think it is an either or.
I really smiled when Obama talked about
the sweep of history.
What he thought the engines of history are, whether it's great men or the mass of economics and education and technology and top-down or bottom-up. And he said in the end, it's both and neither. You just have to take a nuanced view.
The emergence of technologies.
There's something funny about that. You're sitting there being told that by the most powerful man in the world.
But you don't do this alone. And sometimes that's frustrating. But this is the reason why Mr. Churchill only gave 2 cheers for democracy, not 3. Good ending. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Like all good dramas, there's a twist in the tale. Come the fateful day, already getting nervous, I kissed my husband goodbye and went for the taxi to take me to Heathrow to finally meet Obama. It had been raining and I looked down to avoid a puddle, and a push bike came round the corner, and the next thing I knew, my husband was picking me up off the ground and calling an ambulance. I got into the ambulance and I said, forgive me, but I mean, we have to get there really quickly. I've got a plane to catch. What's that, they asked. Well, I'm going to Washington to interview Obama. He looked straight at me, picked up his phone and ordered a brain scan. It took forever in A&E. I'd been carrying a glass Perrier water bottle that shattered, and my face was cut to pieces. There was blood all over. So I missed every plane that day, but there was still one that if I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I could catch to be there in time for the interview. So I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I looked in the mirror, and I was covered with cuts and bruises, and I just looked like a walking disaster. And I thought, I can't sit in front of the coolest man in the world looking like this. And I didn't go. I often feel if we made one of these programs and didn't get the big fish in the end, that would be the end for us. So as the finish line is coming and the transmission date looms, you sort of go around with a nasty feeling in the pit of your stomach. And when they say yes, it's true elation. It's very hard to describe. It's probably what the word happiness means. And 5 minutes later, you start getting worried. Will we blow it? What questions will we ask? Can we get it done in time? But for that minute, there really is nothing quite like it. It's what you stay up all night for. It doesn't happen very often. It happened when Gorbachev's press officer rang us and said the president wanted to do the interview. It happened soon after we delivered the programs to the BBC. Sharon's office said, yes, I think he could do it. It happened when the man who answered the phone at Milosevic's house said, come to President Milosevic's office tomorrow.
I didn't want you, as hard as you've worked on the special, you didn't need a lousy, an uninformed talk.
And it happened with Bill Clinton.
I'm not going to go along with that. I've already told you that. I will not say something to you. I don't turn that camera off.
I know he got mad, but in fact, he also played the game, and we got what we needed. Not a lot of moments in a career of several decades, but it really does make it all worthwhile.